Well, good morning, everybody. It's a really great privilege to be here at this extremely important meeting. I'm a public health physician and work, as has been described, at Public Health England, and also run a public health ethics programme at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I've been asked to talk about future directions in public health. But just before I do that, have a look at this, please. I'm going to come back to these three images later after I tell you a story. As a clue, these are three philosophers, and I'll show you how I'm going to try and bring their relevance to my talk. So in my 15 minutes, I'm going to talk about what public health is, first of all, and very briefly. And then my story is going to be a case study about antimicrobial resistance. And this might appear at first, and indeed whilst I'm telling it, to be at a slight tangent to what you've been discussing yesterday and today. But I'm then going to try and bring that back, reintroducing the philosophers and some environmental philosophy, and weave in the relevance of natural capital to the work we do in public health. So first of all, what is public health? These are the two most commonly used definitions of what public health is. The top one is the one used by our Faculty of Public Health, and it's used internationally as well. Public health work covers very broadly health improvement work around healthy behaviours, smoking, alcohol and so forth, and health protection work. And that's protecting the population from infectious diseases, environmental hazards and toxins, we'll come back to that, and also improvements to health services. And it's collective work, collective action. Public Health England is the national public health agency in this country. It's about 5,000 people, but there are also local directors of public health in local government working on areas such as environmental health all around the country with their teams. So with that in mind, what public health is, my case study of antimicrobial resistance. And before I tell you about the picture of antimicrobial resistance in this country at the moment, a little bit of historical backdrop. Now, bacteria, and I'm going to be talking about antibiotic resistance as antimicrobial resistance. Bacteria were first noticed by Anton von Leeuwenhoek. That's the Belgian draper in the top left-hand corner there. He was using the newly discovered microscope, and he saw small particles moving around. But it was some time, about 200 years, before the link between bacteria and infections were well understood. In that intervening period, people did recognize increasingly that increased attention to infection control and hygiene made a difference. They just weren't sure about the connection. So Semmelweis in the bottom left here was the Hungarian physician who worked in Austria and reduced obstetric mortality in the hospital there. Florence Nightingale was obviously famous for hygiene in field hospitals. Louis Pasteur developed towards the end of the 19th century the germ theory of disease, connecting bacteria and viruses ultimately to causing disease. And if you just look at the middle picture here, Fleming was of course famous for discovery of penicillin in 1928, but it didn't take very long before antibiotic resistance was first recognized. For top left there, 1948, his first recognition of antibiotic resistance. Antibiotics were used in agriculture in the 1950s first. We had the first case of MRSA down the bottom here in the 1960s, and towards the end of the last millennium, the World Health Organization declaring multi-drug resistant TB as a global health emergency. And the bottom right is the British Medical Journal a couple of years ago, the first supposedly completely drug-resistant case of TB in the world, which was in India. So through the 1990s, leading on from that last image, there was a lot of attention to the problem of antibiotic and antimicrobial resistance. I'll come back to what's happened in the first decade of this millennium in a moment, but in this year we just recently had the World Health Organization's surveillance report on the state globally of antibiotic resistance. And that report said it's a big problem globally. It's a big problem because people are dying, and a lot of morbidity and a lot of deaths from infections that they would have been treated much more easily from in previous years. Very high rates across all regions across the world, but significant gaps in surveillance. So the dark green countries here, only the very dark green ones are the countries in which they are surveilling, examining systematically the levels of resistance across the world in at least 5 of the 9 most important bacteria that the WHO label. So the picture could be a lot worse in terms of resistance than we believe it is, and we believe it's pretty bad. Last year in the United States, they released a report on the state of antimicrobial resistance in the United States. That showed 2 million people a year with serious infections that are resistant to antibiotics and about 25,000 deaths. And they classified the various bacteria into hazard levels: urgent, serious, and concerning. So big problem in the States. Just a few weeks ago, President Obama launched a brand new antimicrobial strategy, resistance strategy for the United States. Hand in hand with resistance is antibiotic prescribing. We know that when there's more prescribing, there's more resistance. And again, just this year in Lancet Infectious Diseases, a United States-based study showed that despite the attention that I mentioned in the 1990s to the issue of AMR, antimicrobial resistance, there was a 36% increase globally in antibiotic use. So whatever's that's been done in the 1980s and 1990s does not appear to have had the effect that we would have wished it to have. There's now been, over the last couple of years, a huge amount of increased attention to the problem. In this country, we released last year our own new 5-year strategy that followed on from our Chief Medical Officer's report of 2011 on the left-hand side here, stating how significant she felt, Dame Sally Davies, who's been a global champion for this issue, the situation was, how grave it was in this country. The new strategy in this country has 7 strands. Public Health England's responsible for delivering 4 of those. They're about better education, better training, and so forth. But I'm just going to focus on one of those strands here as part of my story of the situation in this country at the moment. 1 month ago, we published this report. It's called ESPAR. It stands for the Antimicrobial, the English Surveillance Programme. It's our report that gives a picture of resistance and prescribing in this country. And it's the first time that we've had comprehensive data in this country. And it showed that we are not in the place at all that we would wish to be at this country, and that we thought we were. So it showed, in terms of resistance, the number of serious infections around the country, bloodstream infections in hospitals, has been going up over the last 4 years in which we've measured them, 2010 to 2013. And in terms of prescribing around the country, there's been a 6% increase in the last 4 years. So that's, again, despite all the attention that's been given to this. And that 6% is divided up in general practice 4%, hospitals 12%. Most prescribing goes on in general practice. Interestingly, there's huge variation in prescribing across the country. You don't need to look at the text, just look at those 3 pictures of this country. The differentiation between the shades shows you how much variation there is in general practice prescribing, hospital prescribing, obviously the lighter shade being less, very dark the most. Sometimes it's a third to a half higher in some parts of the country than others, and total consumption. But most interestingly is we've graded these colours against the European median, where the colours you see that are mid-purple and dark purple, we are as bad as or worse than the European median. And that is essentially where we're at. We thought that we were in a better place in this country than we are. So there's now, in recognition of this, a huge amount of current attention to antimicrobial resistance. There was a new World Health Assembly resolution last year, something called the Global Health Security Agenda, has antimicrobial resistance as an issue of global health security. And next year we'll have a new World Health Organization action plan that's out in draft on their website now about tackling the issue globally. So I'd just like you to hold on to that thought as antimicrobial resistance and the bad place we're at in this country and globally around this significant public health issue. I'd like to just go back to the three philosophers that I showed at the beginning of the talk. Any takes for the first philosopher? Pardon? Descartes. Thank you. So René Descartes, and Descartes was famous for a number of things, but as a young boy he was trapped in a stove in his farmhouse in rural France, and he was pondering the meaning of life, and came across in his experiences the term cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, how do I know I am alive? In his philosophy, he was hugely important in the history of science and the history of philosophy of science for the Cartesian split, the split that he described, him and others around the period, between fact and value. So fact, the Cartesian dualism, the facts in the way we understand how the body and the world works led to scientific developments in anatomy, physics, chemistry, modern medicine, separated from values that led to ethics, humanities, and so forth, psychology. The Cartesian split. Immanuel Kant, very difficult to read German philosopher from the 18th century. And Kant covered many areas of philosophy, but in his moral philosophy, he's best known now for his categorical imperatives. And one was the universalization principle, only do that which you would wish to be universalized. But the other one is the means-end principle. Never treat other human beings merely as means to your own ends, but as ends in themselves. What I want to draw attention to here is that in Kant's thinking, his moral considerability lies primarily around human beings. What's thought of as being morally considerable is human beings. John Stuart Mill, very famous 19th century philosopher, the founder of utilitarianism, the consequentialist theory, and a normative theory that says, how do we judge what kind of action or rule is most morally right? Well, we look at the consequences of that action or rule, and we look at its impact on the audience, the utility, whether such an act will cause more wealth, better health, happiness, utility than another act. And the one that causes the most utility, the most morally right. He was asked, alongside his friend and colleague, the lawyer Jeremy Bentham, and he considered, should animals and the environment be considered as part of the audience? And they said, well, if the animals are sentient, if they can feel, or if they can suffer. So in utilitarianism, according to Mill, cats or dogs may be morally considerable, but, I don't know, locusts or starfish maybe not. Now, how is this all relevant to my story? Those of you, and I'm sure there's many in the audience today who are familiar with the environmental philosophy work of the last decade or so, and I'll just use Mary Midgley, the wonderful British philosopher, as an example in her fantastic book Science and Poetry. It's about a decade old now. But she argues, amongst others, that in the history of science, over the last 200 or 300 years, if you put together Descartes and the split from fact from value that gave primacy to science over philosophy, humanities, ethics, alongside developments in philosophy that took the environment out of moral considerability. That's how we've ended up in the situation, or one of the reasons why we've ended up in the situation today, where we systematically devalue the environment, that it's not part of that which is widespread, considered part of our moral concern. And at best, when we think about the environment in terms of its moral worth, we think about it in terms of its instrumental value, as an instrument for human well-being. And in the Natural Capital Committee definition of natural capital, I said I would bring my story back home, even that, which I think is very good, has an instrumental value of the environment to human well-being. And environmental philosophers and Midgley and others would say that until we move to a place where we have the environment, or consider the environment as having inherent, intrinsic moral worth of its own, and I was very interested by the example that Bolivia's law suggested, we will be stuck in a place where we continue to systematically degrade the environment. So in the case of antimicrobial resistance, we can and should be doing all the things that we are doing to tackle antimicrobial resistance, and it's a big part of my job. But on the other hand, I feel that unless we stop degrading the environment, unless we stop destroying biodiversity, and of course biodiversity is responsible for the antibiotics that we no longer have. There have been no new antibiotics for the last decade or so. Unless we stop using antibiotics as growth promoters in animals, which is still done in many countries across the world, and the result of that, which is the pollution of land with antibiotics, which leads to further resistance. Unless we change in our public health work and health work the place of the environment, we will remain at a place where we can make limited improvements in terms of environmental health. I could have used a much easier example perhaps than antimicrobial resistance. I've got one more minute and I've got one more slide. I could have used climate change as an example of the centrality of the environment to public health thinking. This is a striking example from Syria and climate change leading to conflict. But antimicrobial resistance is very much in the public eye at the moment. It is a significant, super wicked global health and public health issues. There's no question that antibiotics are an invaluable societal resource, but the question I put to you is, truly tackling antimicrobial resistance will necessitate, in my view, a reconceptualization of the natural environment as having inherent value, and therein, I believe, lies the future direction of public health. Thank you very much.